Good morning. I'd like to thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. When we were living in Texas, Tristan and I had the opportunity to host a small group at our home every Sunday evening. I remember one evening as we were wrapping up, one of our members' 5-year-old daughter came and tugged on me. She said she needed to ask me a question, so we sat down on the couch and I looked at her and said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Mr. Jeremy, do you and Miss Trista ever fight?" Honestly, at that moment, I was thinking, I really wish you would have asked me to explain the deeper theological implications of the Holy Spirit or to explain the prophecies in Daniel, because that's a tough question. I mean, does your preacher ever fight with his wife? I wasn't really sure what to say, so I just took a deep breath and told her the truth. Yeah, there are times that I fight with Miss Trista. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't love her and I don't love her. It just means sometimes we get a little cattywampus. After they left our house and we were cleaning up, I was telling Trista about the conversation that I had with this little girl, and I asked her the same question I want to ask you this morning. If the walls of your house could talk, what story would they tell? Would they tell the story of joy and laughter, or would they tell the story of conflict and anger, or would they tell the story of two strangers who avoid one another while living in the same space? Maybe you grew up in a home where your mom and dad were always fighting, and you remember lying in bed at night trying to cover your ears with the sides of your pillow so you could muffle out the fighting. You determined it was going to be different for me. I'm not going to yell the way that my mom yelled, but you yell. You think, I'm not going to be passive and unengaged the way that my dad was, but every night you retreat to the couch and pick up your phone and tune out. If the walls of your house could talk, what story would they tell? I've forgotten so much in my life, but there are things that I remember. I remember how on my wedding day, in front of all of our friends and family, I pledged that I would love Trista for better or for worse, for richer or for poor, for sickness and in health. Many of you made the exact same pledge, and I know that at that moment, you really meant it. But then something unexpected happens. We didn't know that the economy was going to tank and that he wouldn't be able to find a job. You didn't know that she was going to struggle with depression or that you would have a child that's difficult. You didn't know that your husband was going to become so unattentive or that your wife was going to just stop caring. Something in your story changed, and now the next thing you know, you find yourself stuck. You feel like it's all worse and poorer and sickness. And you think, this is not the way it's supposed to be. If the walls of your house could talk, would they tell the story of commitment and courage, or would there be stories of brokenness and disappointment? You start off thinking that you're going to go through this life holding hands and falling asleep in each other's arms at night, but instead of a love story, your house would tell the story of business partners. Your stories about managing the household chores and passing off your kids from one extracurricular activity to the other. The romance is long gone, and now you find yourself in the exact same situation that 10,000 other couples find themselves in every week. You have no idea how in the world you got there. My guess is if you asked David, he would have never imagined that his story would have become such a train wreck. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we read those horrible words, in the springtime when the kings were off at war, but David stayed behind. He doesn't go off to war where he should have been. He stays in his palace. And in a mere 7 pages in my Bible, we read that a man after God's own heart has an affair and rapes Bathsheba. He tries to deceive Uriah. He has him murdered. And just when you think the story's not going to get any worse than that, if you just keep reading, you find out that Amnon follows his dad's lead, but he rapes his half-sister Tamar. Tamar tells her brother Absalom about what happened, and he plots for 2 years before Absalom kills Amnon, and then they start a civil war that ends with Absalom's death. Talk about a story that makes a hard left turn and then just drops off a cliff. How do you get from a man's after God's own heart to a total train wreck? Have you ever watched a movie or a TV show that uses reverse chronology. The beginning seems very dramatic. You're not really sure what's happening. And then they shift back and they show you that everything that led up to that point. I want us to try that this morning with David. Before we get to his rape of Bathsheba, the cover-up, the rape of his daughter, the death of his son, the civil war, let's go back and see where it all started. Usually, by the time somebody comes to my office to talk about struggles that they're having, they want to talk about how everything's fallen apart. They want to talk about the affair or the marriage that's coming to an end. Usually, the person who's telling me the story has no idea how we got to this point. They say something like, I thought everything was okay, and then she moved out. Or I thought everything was okay, and then he walked in with those divorce papers in his hand. What I want to do this morning is I want us to go back to where things start to fall apart with David's family life. And we find that in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 15, where we read, "So David and the house of Israel carried the covenant chest of the Eternal One up to the city of David, with shouts and the sounding of trumpets. When Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Eternal without thought of how he looked, she hated him." I wonder if this scene would have played out differently, how it would have changed the rest of the story, how it would have changed the whole course of David's family life. I mean, at this point, David is married to his first wife, Michal, the wife of his youth, and the beginning of their life together was kind of romantic. David's about 18 years of age when he receives Saul's daughter's hand in marriage as a kind of reward for defeating Goliath. It's got all the romance of a fairy tale. Win the battle, win the heart of the girl. But by the time we get to 2 Samuel 6, it looks like things are going pretty well for David. I mean, he's now become the king. Things at the office are good. The nation of Israel is a world power. The Ark of the Covenant is finally being returned to the city. There's this great celebration. And in the middle of that celebration, David begins to dance before God without regard about anyone else and what's going on. His bride, Michal, is watching all of this, and she's embarrassed by her husband's behavior. I mean, there is such a thing as decorum, and here's the king dancing in front of all of these people, all of these women. Wives know firsthand what it's like to have your husbands embarrass you in public. It's kind of like our job description. But we get to verse 20 and we read that when David returns home to bless his own family, in other words, David comes home, he's in a good mood, it's been a great day, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. And right out of the gate, she says, and I want you to catch the sarcasm here, she said in disgust, "How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do." So David comes home from this great day of celebration, and the very first thing that she does when he walks in the door is she sarcastically lays into him. And in his immaturity, David gives it right back to her. He's immediately defensive and he says, "I was dancing before the Lord who chose me above your father and all his family." David goes straight into fighting language. He brings up the in-laws. I mean, that's never a good strategy in marital conflict. This beautiful scene of David dancing before the Lord has this horrible ending. The story ends by saying, so Michal, the daughter of Saul, remained childless throughout her entire life. The Jeremy Houck version says that they quit sleeping together. And that's the end. You never read of Michal in Scripture again. This is an important part of David's story because, well, everything in Scripture is important, but this is a pivotal part of history. I believe that if things would have gone differently in this moment, then maybe it would have changed a lot of other moments in the story. For just a moment, I want you to think about how things would have been different if David would have included Michal in on the celebration. What if he would have gone home and made sure that she had come out to celebrate the ark of the Lord returning with him? What if she would have been encouraging to her husband? I mean, this was a great, momentous occasion for him. What if when he walked in, she would have given him a big hug and celebrated with him? What if David would have actually listened to her concerns, and tried to see things from her perspective? What if she wouldn't have been so sarcastic right out of the gate? What if instead of being sarcastic, instead of being critical, what if she would have praised him for the wonderful thing that had just happened? What if she hadn't attacked him personally? What if David had tried to be more understanding of where she was and how she felt? What if she wasn't so insecure? What if David would have said, "I'm sorry"? What if David would have asked, "Can you forgive me"? What if David would have fought for the wife of his youth with the same passion and faith that he fought the giant Goliath? I mean, how could have any of those things changed the rest of the story? I really believe that the stories of our marriages and our families are written in those seemingly insignificant moments of our lives. I mean, we see the big moments and we think David's failure was when he went out and he looked for Bathsheba bathing on the roof. That's when everything fell apart. But that's not how we got there. It's the accumulative effect of all of these small decisions within our marriages and our families that ultimately write the story of who we are. Honestly, though, we don't think of it like that. We only tend to focus and notice the big moments where everything falls apart, but there are all of these things that lead up to that big moment of failure. When we lived in Georgia, one morning we got up and we noticed one of these big, beautiful, stately oak trees in our yard had blown over. I called a friend of mine to come and to help me cut this big tree up. And when he got there, as we were working, I remarked how bad the storm had to be to knock such a big oak tree over. And my friend looked at me and said, "It wasn't the storm that knocked the tree over. The tree had been falling for a long time. The tree was rotten. It was just the storm that blew it over." I think that's a pretty good illustration of how a lot of our marriages and our families work out. We see the moment that the tree falls, we see the storm, and we want to point to that moment and say, that was the problem. But there's been an awful lot of things causing decay and rot in our marriages and in our relationships that get us up to that moment. In 2 Samuel 6, there are some helpful lessons that can teach us how to deal with conflict that often leads to our trees falling. So, as we wrap up our time together this morning, I'm going to slip out of preacher mode into counselor mode, and I want us to notice a few things from this passage that I think can help us in our relationships. And the first thing that we need to understand is when there is conflict in a relationship, our job is to identify the real issue. And it takes time to do this. I understand how hard it is in the heat of the moment to identify what the real problem is. Michal attacks David as soon as he walks in the house, and he immediately becomes defensive, and that's when the fight starts. But what would have happened if David would have stopped and actually listened to what she was saying? I mean, maybe the reason that Michal said what she said was based on her wanting to be invited. She wanted to celebrate with him. Maybe the reason she felt the way that she did was because she was just feeling insecure that day. She was having an awful day, or she's really missed him because he was gone. And she noticed that instead of him coming home, he goes out and he dances around with these slave girls. Maybe Michal was just looking for a little love and a little affirmation. Maybe that's the issue they were facing. Maybe the issue that you have is that your husband comes home late, or is it that you never know when he's going to come home? Or is it when he comes home, he's on his cell phone all the time, checking texts and emails, and he's home, but he acts like he's still at work? If you want to live in peace and harmony, you have to find the root issue and not the symptom to the problem. Deal with the root issue. Next, if you want to find peace, you have to find a good time and place to have difficult conversations. And this is huge. There are a lot of places where we can have difficult conversations. We've just got to make sure that the environment is right to talk and to listen to one another. I mean, the fourth quarter of a football game with the score tied and the clock running out is not the time or place to bring up difficult issues. When somebody's in the kitchen cooking your supper, making sure everything gets done at the exact same time, that's not the time or place to mention that you're feeling ignored. There are plenty of places to have difficult conversations. On the back porch, sitting in a porch swing, or around the dinner table after a good meal, or in your bedroom away from the kids. There are lots of places and times to encourage and spiritually build up our children and our spouses. So if we want to have a good marriage, we have to be intentional about having good conversations. I mean, think about it. As soon as David walks in the door, Michal lays into him. That's not the time and that's not the place. I understand she needed to express some things to him, but she could have done it in a better time and found a better place to do it. In the same way, David should have had the maturity to say, hey, can you just give me a few moments to kind of get home and to acclimate and then have that discussion a little later? We can sit down and talk about it in a few minutes. It's always a good idea to take a time out from time to time to make sure that you talk about the root issues and not the symptoms. It's important to find the right time and the right place where we can set aside the defensiveness and our emotion and discover what the real issue is. And that's how we can deal with it. I think the third thing that we learn from the story that will help us in our relationships is you got to stick to the issue. David immediately goes into fight mode and he brings up the in-laws. Have you discovered there's a fair way to fight and there's an unfair, a dirty way to fight? I've noticed that the first person to bring up an in-law is the first person to fight dirty. David immediately expands this argument by bringing the in-laws into the fight, and it just goes downhill from there. Honestly, we all have a tendency to do that. We take the issue and we want to make it bigger and broader, and that's oftentimes where everything falls apart. Find out what the issue is and fight fair. Deal with the issue. And finally, I like to always start with a positive. I know David wasn't thinking about Michal when he's jumping and dancing around, and she didn't like what he was doing, but maybe she could have begun that conversation by saying something positive. Maybe she could have started by talking about how wonderful it was to have the ark back in Jerusalem. I mean, this was a great day of celebration. What David really wanted was for his wife to be more impressed with him than the slave girls were. Yet, instead of her being impressed and her giving him a little praise, she meets him with this sarcasm. She's critical, and it takes the strength right out of him. He's hoping to come home and get some encouragement. He wants to win the heart of his wife. He wants to impress her, but she just meets him with criticism and sarcasm. I think some of us understand this better than others. Solomon writes in Proverbs 21:19, "You would be better off living in the middle of the desert than with an angry and argumentative wife." In other words, if your wife likes to fight with you, you might be better off just walking out into the desert and setting up your house out there. Ladies, let me let you in on a little secret this morning. Nothing drives a man to apathy quicker than a wife who's critical. Negative and discouragement doesn't build up your husband. When a wife is critical and negative, her husband, who's inclined to naturally want to win her heart, feels like nothing he does is good enough. He feels like he just can't win, so why even try? The Bible calls our wives and our mothers to be the spiritual encouragers in the home. That's God's role for our wives and our moms, to be that spiritual encourager to her husband and to her children. Michal comes at David. She's critical, sarcastic, negative. But what would have happened if her intent was to be encouraging to David? Don't misunderstand me. David's not blameless in all of this either. Paul tells the Christians in Ephesus that the husbands are to love their wives the way that Christ loves the church. And we read in the Bible that Jesus is the great reconciler. He's the one who goes, he's the one who pursues. It's on us as husbands to be the reconcilers in our families. So what would have happened in the rest of the story if David would have taken that approach? How would the story have been different if David came in and met that sarcasm trying to reconcile with Michal instead of fighting with her? I think it would have gone in a dramatically different direction. This morning, if the walls in your house could talk, I hope that they would tell the story of God's grace and mercy. I mean, I understand that my family, your family, we're not perfect. But the walls of our homes could tell the story of God's redeeming power. I pray that from this moment on, our homes will tell the story of God's healing hand and what God can do when we give Him all of the broken pieces of our lives. I pray that our homes will be this beautiful mosaic showing how God can put all of these broken pieces back together and make a beautiful picture of redemption and love. David can't hit rewind. He can't go and do things over again, but he does bring all of these broken pieces to God, and he allows God to use that whole mess for His glory. I mean, we get to the first chapter of the New Testament, and we're finally introduced to Jesus. The moment that we have longed for and waited for is finally here, and Jesus is introduced as the Son of David. I mean, only God can do that. God calls Jesus the Son of David, the same man whose family was such a mess, where everything fell apart, yet God worked all of that out. And if God can do that in the life of David, imagine what He can do in your life and your family with all of your broken pieces. That's the centerpiece of the table. We go to the table, we take the bread, and we take the cup as a way to remember what God has done to put our lives back together and to hope for what God is going to do with the broken pieces of our lives. God sees all of our broken pieces scattered across the floor, all of our bad decisions, all of our selfish and immature mistakes, and through the body and the blood of Christ, He brings redemption. So as you go to the table this morning, my hope is that we can take a moment to focus on the great redemption offered to us through this beautiful sacrifice. Because the walls of your house do tell a story. And it's my hope and it's my prayer that we are intentional to make sure that the story that is told is God's story. God's story of forgiveness, God's story of mercy, God's story of love, God's story of grace, God's story of hope, God's story of welcome. And so as you go to the table this morning, I hope that you have the time and the opportunity and that you will take the space to think about the story that's being told. Because there is a story worth telling. We just have to make sure that we are invested and involved in the greatest story ever told. I hope you have a wonderful time around the table this morning. Never ever forget how deeply you're loved. I look forward to seeing you very soon. Please, go in peace.